Rain hammered the streets, turning every surface into a shimmering blur. Mark pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he hurried along the sidewalk, his 5-year-old son's small hand tucked securely in his own. The boy's hood kept slipping, and Mark kept tugging it back into place, anxious to get them home before the storm worsened. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed someone sitting on the curb. At first, he thought it was just another pedestrian waiting for the bus, but as lightning briefly lit the street, he saw her more clearly. A young woman in scrubs, hair plastered to her face, shoulders trembling, not from the cold alone, but from the soft, broken sobs she couldn't contain. Her hospital badge swung slightly with the wind, the rain streaking down her cheeks as if the sky itself was crying with her. She clutched a small duffel bag to her chest like it was the last thing in the world she owned. Cars splashed past without slowing, strangers passed with their heads down, pretending not to see. Mark hesitated for only a moment. He had places to be, dinner to make, bedtime routines to keep. But something about her expression, a mix of exhaustion, heartbreak, and quiet desperation, rooted him to the spot. His son tugged at his hand, confused, but Mark knew he couldn't just keep walking. In that instant, the storm around him faded, and all he could see was a human being in pain, alone in the rain. Mark crouched down beside her, the cold rain soaking through his jeans. "Hey," he said gently, "are you okay?" She startled, blinking up at him as if unsure whether to answer. Up close, he could see the deep shadows under her eyes, the way her fingers trembled as they clutched the worn strap of her bag. His son stood a few steps behind, watching silently, the hood of his raincoat slipping again. Mark shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without asking. She tried to protest, murmuring something about not wanting to trouble him, but her voice cracked, and the words dissolved into the sound of rain. Her name was Emily. Between pauses, she explained that she'd just finished a double shift at the hospital. She had been taking every extra hour she could get, not for herself, but to cover her mother's mounting medical bills. But even with the overtime, she had fallen behind on rent. That morning, her landlord had changed the locks. She'd come back after work to find her things in bags, sitting in the hall. She hadn't had the strength to carry them all, so she grabbed what she could and left. Now, she had nowhere to go, no friends close by, no family who could take her in. Her voice was almost swallowed by the storm, but Mark heard every word. There was a tired dignity in the way she spoke, as though she'd told herself she could survive this, yet wasn't sure she truly believed it. Mark stood there, the rain pooling in his shoes, feeling the weight of Emily's story settle into his chest. He thought of his own nights after his wife passed, those first months when every bill felt like a battle, every bedtime an uphill climb, and the silence of the apartment a kind of punishment. He knew what it was to feel cornered by life. His son shifted closer to him, small fingers finding his again, as if sensing the heaviness in the air. "You can't stay out here," Mark said finally, his voice steady but urgent. Emily shook her head, murmuring that she'd figure something out, that she didn't want to cause any trouble. He could see she meant it, this was a woman who was used to carrying her burdens alone. But Mark had made his decision before she even finished speaking. "My couch is clean, my heat works, and my kid doesn't mind company," he said. "It's just one night. Let's get you out of the rain." For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if the offer didn't quite make sense. People didn't do this, take in strangers on the side of the road, especially with a child in the mix. But the wind whipped harder, the rain found its way down her collar, and something in her resolve cracked. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then rose to her feet. As they began walking, she clutched her duffel bag even tighter, like it held the last fragments of her life, and followed the man who'd chosen kindness over caution. Inside Mark's modest apartment, the storm sounded softer, like a distant drumbeat against the windows. Emily stood just inside the door, hesitant, as if afraid to take up too much space. Mark's son darted into the living room, pulling out a mismatched pile of toy cars and trucks. Without thinking, he held one out to her. She crouched down, smiled faintly, and took it, rolling it back to him across the carpet. While Mark changed into dry clothes, Emily sat with the boy, asking him about his favorite toys and the pictures taped to the fridge. Soon, his shy answers grew into a stream of excited chatter. Her laugh, quiet at first, began to warm the room. In the kitchen, Mark stirred a pot of pasta, listening to their voices carry over the sound of the boiling water. He realized he hadn't heard that kind of easy laughter in his home for a long time. It was the kind that filled more than just the air, it filled the hollow spaces inside you. When he peeked into the living room, he saw Emily leaning forward, patiently fixing the wheels on a broken toy truck while his son watched with wide-eyed admiration. In that moment, Mark saw something more than gratitude in her face. He saw the way her shoulders had lowered, the way her hands moved with a nurse's steady care even when no one was in a hospital bed. It struck him, sometimes the people who give the most are the ones who've been running on empty the longest. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world washed and bright. Mark brewed coffee while Emily sat at the kitchen table, hair still damp from her shower, hands wrapped around a warm mug. She looked different, still tired, but with a quiet steadiness in her eyes. Over breakfast, they talked about next steps. Mark made a few calls to friends from his church and a neighbor who volunteered at a local shelter. Within hours, he'd helped her find a temporary room and connected her with a community program that could cover part of her rent until she got back on her feet. Emily protested at first, insisting she didn't want to be a burden. But Mark only smiled and told her that when his wife died, it was the kindness of strangers that had carried him through. "This isn't a debt," he said. "It's just the way the world's supposed to work." Over the next week, Emily stopped by often, sometimes to drop off cookies, sometimes just to see Mark's son, who now greeted her with an uncontainable grin. She started to feel like part of their small, imperfect family. One evening, as she watched the boy line up his toy cars in a neat row, Emily thought about that night in the rain. She'd lost nearly everything, but not hope. And hope, it seemed, had a way of finding you in the form of people who cared enough to stop, listen, and open their door. Kindness, she realized, could change the weather inside a life.